Great stuff. So it's set to speaker and slide view, so it just records you speaking at the time, and Stephen and Shari. So when you're speaking, it'll record you and the slides that are up. And then the plan is to make the webinar available to people on the website. So we'll let people know when it's on there.
Great, thank you.
Great, okay, and Dan's going to keep an eye on the chat for us. I'll say a little bit more about that when we start. Well, great. So people who introduce themselves in the chat, I think everyone can access the chat box. So yeah, feel free to introduce yourself and say hi to everyone else. Let people know where you're from, which organisation you're from. Share contact details if you wish. And then we'll make a start. So thanks everyone for joining us today for this webinar. So it's the launch of our local anti-poverty strategies, good practice and effective approaches report, which we launched today. And great to have so many people from across Greater Manchester, but also across the country as a whole, signed up for the webinar. That's fantastic to see. So I'm just going to introduce things. If you go to the next slide, Penny. Just talk you through what we're going to do over the next hour and a half. So I'll just talk you through sort of the aims of the work, aims of today's event, aims of the report overall, a bit of background, talk about sort of direction of travel that we need to be moving in terms of local responses to poverty across the country. Penny, who's the lead author on the report, who's our policy officer at Greater Manchester Poverty Action, she's going to talk through the report in detail, findings, recommendations, tell you a bit more about the work that we've done that sits behind the research that sits behind this report. And then we're really pleased to have both Shari from Salford Council and Stephen Sinclair from us. Shari's going to talk about Salford City Council's journey, and Stephen's going to talk about what we can learn from Scotland, from the work that he's heavily involved in, and where there's a much clearer anti-poverty agenda in place, both at the Scottish Government and then therefore local level north of the border. Got an opportunity for questions as well after we've heard from Shari and Stephen. So people should be able to access the chat box. So if you want to put questions in there as we go through, we won't respond to them as they're coming in. We'll wait until we get to that Q&A section. And then my colleague Dan's going to keep an eye on those and send some over to me. So we won't necessarily be able to respond to everyone's question or comment with the time that we've got, but we'll keep a record of them all so we can get back to people afterwards. But we'll pick a few out and we'll ask Stephen and Shari and Penny to provide their responses and thoughts at that stage. And then we've got a bit in terms of sort of next steps in terms of this work to tell you about in terms of where we go next, how you can work with Greater Manchester Poverty Action going forward, and some of the opportunities there. So I'll fill you in on those at the end of the event. So next slide, Penny. So in terms of this work, I mean, the aim is really to re-energise the conversation around local strategic approaches to addressing poverty and inspire local authorities and their partners. And that partnership bit is really important, as you'll hear from us today, across the country to strengthen or create local anti-poverty approaches. So for some of you from local authorities or partner organisations, you may be in a place where there's already a local anti-poverty strategy in place. I know from quite a few of the people that booked on, that is the case, but we also know there's lots of interest from local authorities and partners across the country who haven't got strategies in place in introducing one, and the report speaks to the needs of both those who've already got strategy in place, but also those who are looking to develop one. Next slide, Penny. So just say, actually, if you just go back, Penny, quickly there, I missed my prompt that I put in myself there. Just in terms of promoting today's webinar and the report on social media, the hashtag we've been using is anti-poverty strategies. So if you've got any comments, reflections on the report and the things that we're talking about in today's webinar, please do share them on Twitter using that hashtag. And our Twitter handle is at GM Poverty Action. We're also posting on LinkedIn as well, so keep an eye out on LinkedIn if you're on it for details of the report on there as well. Next slide, Penny. So just to say a little bit about, I think a lot of people on the call are used to me going through at least half a dozen slides on telling you about Greater Manchester Poverty Action. So you'll be relieved to know that I'm not doing that today. But just to say, our vision very much remains of a Greater Manchester free from poverty, where all residents can realise their potential and access the benefits of living in a vibrant and successful city region. One of our 3 strategic priorities is making sure that there are strong, robust strategic responses to poverty in place across Greater Manchester, both at a local authority level and also at a combined authority level. And for some of the people on the call who are from combined authorities, would just say at this point that the report and the recommendations are very much relevant to combined authorities as well as local authorities. So do bear that in mind. So as an organisation, we've also increasingly been working with local authorities and partners outside of Greater Manchester, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Next slide, Penny. Now, one of the issues that we're obviously dealing with, or dealing with several issues at the moment, we're in a sort of era of perpetual crisis, where localities are firefighting, whether it's the pandemic, cost of living crisis, inflation, consequences of the war in Ukraine. There's obviously been a host of challenges facing local authorities and partners over recent years. And the backdrop, of course, is a period where budgets for local authorities and other public service providers have been cut over a sustained period. So real challenges there. But as we know, poverty isn't a new problem. It may be being compounded by some of those challenges and crises that we're facing at the moment. But poverty isn't a new problem in Greater Manchester nor across the UK as a whole. And one of the things that we're really keen to set out as an organisation is that we need to think about long-term responses to poverty locally and preventing and reducing poverty locally as much, if not more, than thinking about short-term crisis responses. And that's something that we often talk to stakeholders in Greater Manchester and beyond about. Next slide, Penny. So clearly there should be a national mission to end poverty in the UK. There isn't. There is a much clearer poverty agendas in Scotland and Wales, and Penny's going to touch on that, as will Stephen, a little bit later. But if there was a national mission to end poverty in the UK set by central government, clearly we'd all recognise that localities would be central to that mission and would have a really important role to play. Since the dismantling of the Child Poverty Act, there's been very much an absence of leadership on the issue of poverty at Westminster level. And I think what we saw in sort of 10 years ago, at the onset of austerity, many localities understandably thought, wow, okay, there's all these social security cuts and reforms coming into place at central government level. Central government's no longer asking us to have local child poverty strategies in place. And really there was a move away from the agenda in a lot of places at that time. In recent years, we've seen localities across the country really embracing an anti-poverty agenda in spite of the national drivers of poverty sitting with central government, in spite of funding constraints, in spite of a lack of direction from central government. Localities across the country are really sort of asking that question, okay, what can we do to tackle poverty in spite of some of those challenges? And many of local authorities, including many in Greater Manchester, have either implemented or are implementing local poverty strategies. Next slide, Pen. And just in terms of the touch, I mean, the report that we put out today is very much about how do you go about developing a robust and effective anti-poverty strategy. What are the things that you need to put in place to do that? But just to touch on some of the things that you can then do in terms of policy and practice, clearly there is still much more that we can do at the local level to respond to poverty, whether it's supporting adoption of the real living wage by employers, whether it's taking a cash first approach to local welfare assistance schemes and the household support fund, whether it's driving up take up of benefits, whether it's introducing other changes to local welfare assistance schemes and things like council tax support, Clearly, there are those levers that sit at a local government level that can be pulled, and often it's really important to bring partners into that conversation when considering, okay, what are the things that we can do? And we'll say a little bit more about some of that at the end of the webinar today. Next slide, Penny. And one of the things that we're seeing as Greater Manchester Poverty Action against across the city region as a whole is some increasing sort of commonality across boroughs as to approaches in the sort of the poverty space. So we've got a number of boroughs who've got anti-poverty strategies in place, given Manchester and Salford as examples on the slide here. A number of our boroughs in Greater Manchester have adopted the socioeconomic duty, which Penny will touch on later, but done other things like become real living wage accredited councils and use that as a catalyst for advancing the real living wage agenda in their localities. So some commonality emerging across boroughs in Greater Manchester, and we know from the work that Penny's been doing on this report that councils in other parts of the country are also taking similar steps, which is really encouraging to see. Next slide, Penny. Increasingly, we've been working with councils and their partners across the country on things like adopting the socioeconomic duty, and also as an organisation, we do contribute to those national policy debates. One of the things that we're seeing is that there's a clear need for locally led approaches, but localities, local authorities and their partners want guidance around how do you develop an anti-poverty strategy, what does good look like. There's clearly a need in that kind of sharing of good practice space as well. And so our report, Local Anti-Poverty Strategies, Good Practice and Effective Approaches, very much responds to those needs, enabling localities to take a structured, systematic approach to developing plans to fight poverty locally. So we're really pleased to have put this bit of work together. Been a big bit of work. Penny will touch on methodology when she's going through her slide, and you'll see that we've been informed by a lot of experts, including people with lived experience of poverty in the development of this work, and by 6 local authorities from across the country who've got anti-poverty strategies in place at the moment. So I'm going to pass over to Penny now, who's our policy officer at Greater Manchester Poverty Action, who's led on this work, and she's going to talk you through the findings and the recommendations.
So thanks, Graham. So thank you all for being here today. So today I'll be talking through the findings and recommendations of our latest report, Local Anti-Poverty Strategies, Good Practice and Effective Approaches. So this is just an overview of my slides. So before I begin going through the findings and recommendations of the report, I will give a brief overview of the policy context of local anti-poverty strategies. So in the 1990s to early 2000s, local anti-poverty strategies were a significant feature of local government landscape. So what we see is that the scale of local anti-poverty strategies grows dramatically, and this is in response to growing poverty and a lack of interest by the government at the time. So local authorities began to recognise the importance of local poverty as one which should be within local policy development. So as such, the majority of research that we have drawn upon in the report is from this era. So in 1997, when Labour came to power, addressing poverty came to the forefront. And in 2003, free child poverty indicators are introduced. So in 2010, we saw that the Child Poverty Act was passed. So as part of the Act, local and other delivery partners in England were required to conduct a local needs assessment and produce child poverty strategies. However, in 2016, we see that this Act is scrapped, scrapping the targets, measures, reporting duties and requirements for national and local anti-poverty strategies. Following the UK government's decision to scrap the Act, we see that actually in Scotland in 2017, they passed the Child Poverty Act. So the Scottish government approach has elements of a strategic approach to anti-poverty policy, and local authorities and health boards in Scotland have a duty to produce local child poverty action reports. So we've also drawn on lessons learned in the report from the Scottish approach. So currently there is no plan or strategy to address poverty at a national level. Poverty is on the rise, yet we see the government's response to the cost of living has been on short-term policy fixes. So we know it's within the power of the government to offer sustainable solutions, but there is little will to act on this at the present time. So whilst we know that the main drivers to poverty lie with central government, the rising demand and calls of action from communities means that the role of localities in taking the lead to address poverty has become increasingly important. So there are examples of good practice and impact from places where there is a strong policy and strategic focus on addressing poverty delivered through and steered by a robust anti-poverty strategy. However, there is a lack of up-to-date research that explores best practice and effective approaches in the design and implementation of anti-poverty strategies. So within this research, we've aimed to fill this gap by developing new thinking and valuable insights about the most effective ways to develop and implement anti-poverty strategies. So the research had three aims. So we wanted to highlight anti-poverty strategies across the country. We also wanted to develop a framework for local authorities and partners to use who are seeking to implement or enhance their strategic approaches. So we also would like to mention that the findings, as Graham has said, are also relevant to the work of combined authorities, as we know there is growing interest in the role of combined authorities in addressing poverty. So firstly, it's important to understand what is actually a local anti-poverty strategy, and most importantly, what they are not. So what is an anti-poverty strategy? So it identifies the key issues contributing to poverty and sets out priorities for actions agreed with partners that are designed to address poverty. And what it isn't and it shouldn't be a catch-all list of work that is being done. And it's not a shelved internal document, it's front-facing and open to scrutiny by internal and external stakeholders. So the next slide is actually why should local authorities and partners bother? So it's understandable that there will be apprehension about what value an anti-poverty strategy adds. So we recognise in the context of depleting resources and limited and declining powers makes what local authorities and partners would ideally like to do incredibly difficult. But it may also be questioned that local authorities are already doing much of this work, so why actually does a local anti-poverty strategy matter? Well, we argue in the report that actually local anti-poverty strategies should not be overlooked, and they add value in three ways. So firstly, they set out clear objectives and set out how they will be achieved, underpinned by a shared understanding of poverty and its causes. Secondly, they improve coordination and empower key local stakeholders to do more to address poverty, as there is a coherent framework helping to marshal limited resources and capacity, and they also foster a collective determination to do better for local communities. And then thirdly, they increase accountability for action, as they actually provide measurable targets to see if actually actions set out are making a difference. But also that's important to mention is that actually it's important to look at the long term. So it's actually about being able to learn as the strategy progresses. So on the next slide, I will just give a very brief overview of the methods that we chose. And I must say that this is available in much more detail within the actual report. So we conducted secondary research, so we conducted a literature review, exploring some of the key elements relating to a strategic approach to tackling poverty. We also conducted semi-structured interviews with local authority representatives from each of the case studies. We conducted 2 expert panel discussions with poverty experts from around the country, and we also conducted a focus group with people with lived experience of poverty from each Greater Manchester borough. So on this slide just depicts the case study selection. So the report features 6 case studies, so Salford City, East Devon, Cambridge City, Scottish Borders and Rother District. So we were interested in gathering a geographical spread across the UK, and this was informed by our literature review findings and overarching population focus. We must say though that this was small scale research, so we only chose a very small sample size, so this is no way an exhaustive example of all the different approaches that are going on across the country. So I will just give you a brief overview of the each case study. So within the report, we explore the context, scope and design, development of the strategy, delivery of the strategy, and monitoring and evaluation of each strategy. So, for example, we've got Salford City. So whilst the council is really aware that there is no magic bullet to address poverty at a local level, the strategy and its action plan really provide a clear agenda for actions to be taken, embedding an anti-poverty culture within the council, and they really put people with lived experience at the heart of the decision making. So Shari will be talking a bit more about their approach after I've spoken. Then we have Rother District. So this is a very small area, but the council is realistic in its ambitions. So it's limited in what it can do, but despite this, the strategy and its action plan are part of its new approach to making positive changes on actually what it can control. And again, increasing its influence to engage with others who can make a difference on areas it can't control. We then have East Devon District. So whilst again, the council recognises they do not have all the answers and many areas are outside of their control, they are committed to making sure that the council uses its power and influence where possible to make a difference to its residents. So we heard from East Devon that having a clear framework for addressing poverty has really focused the council on areas it can make a difference to improve and influence. We then have Cambridge, which whilst Cambridge is a wealthy, fast-growing city, it's got a strong economy and there's significant employment growth, it is a divided city. So in light of the inequality in Cambridge, they have developed an anti-poverty strategy. And this strategy really looks at tackling both the underlying causes and immediate effects of poverty, and they work in partnership with key local stakeholders. We then have Leicester City Council. So the council is really committed to working with its partners to improve and develop new services to those who need the most help. So the council's anti-poverty framework and approach are on a microsite, which is different to the other strategies, to allow the strategy to be constantly updated as the national and local situation changes. And then finally, we have the Scottish Borders anti-poverty strategy. So as I mentioned previously, there is legislation in Scotland that requires local authorities to have local child action reports. But in the Scottish Borders, they felt that having a dedicated anti-poverty strategy was really important because they felt that there was actually a lack of coordination between the council and its key partners. So again, having this overarching framework has really focused efforts. So on the next slide, I've just got some of the focus group findings. So as you can see, there are 5 key themes that emerged when we spoke to people with lived experience of poverty from each of the boroughs. So the overall themes in the focus group really highlighted that for local anti-poverty strategies to be effective, requires local authorities to develop a person-centred approach. So this means that councils need to commit to ensuring that people with lived experience of poverty and those working on the front line can shape the development, delivery and implementation of anti-poverty strategies. So what really came out in the first theme was actually that there's not a great understanding of access to council services. So really local anti-poverty strategies can be the vehicle to ensure there is a clear understanding in communities of support available. We then heard from people that they actually experience stigma and discrimination when reaching out for support. So really local authorities have a duty to make sure that they are tackling the stigma associated with poverty. And within a local anti-poverty strategy should be actions that set out how they are going to make that difference. Then the third theme that we came across was actually there's a lack of coordination between a range of services. So people can feel like they're being bounced back, no questions are being answered. So really anti-poverty strategies must be developed in coordination with key partners to make sure there is joined up working to get away from this kind of bounce back situation. And then the fourth theme that really came out was that there needs to be a focus on long-term changes. So the focus of anti-poverty strategies must be on developing long-term solutions to reduce and prevent poverty whilst also recognising the need to develop effective financial crisis support. And then finally, which is arguably the most important, it is central that engagement with people with lived experience of poverty is focused on co-production rather than just listening. So actually participation needs to be meaningful, and there should be mechanisms for understanding how has people's input in, for example, consultations had an impact on direct policy making. So in the next slides, I'm going to go through the key recommendations from the report. So there was 12 key elements that we found based on our findings. So based on our findings, we have developed a framework of the key elements for an effective anti-poverty strategy based on our literature review, focus group, semi-structured interviews, and expert panel discussions. So an anti-poverty strategy will only be successful if it is supported by the elements identified in the framework, and all the elements are complementary and interdependent. However, it must be said that this is not intended to be an off-the-shelf approach, rather it is to be used as the basis for developing and/or enhancing local anti-poverty strategies. So what's really important, it's about using the key elements identified and building on local assets unique to each community. And again, good practice is not static, and strategies need to be sustainable in completing current actions and adapting to future needs and changes. So in the next couple of slides, I will be going through each of the elements. So the first element that I'll talk about is defining poverty and its drivers. So understanding the nature and determinants of poverty was important to all the local authorities featured in the report. So adopting a relative and absolute understanding was important. So having this shared understanding of poverty was really the cornerstone for action, as stakeholders understood their role more clearly. And also it's important to say that misunderstanding poverty and conflating its risks, causes and consequences leads to stigma. So it's essential that local authorities have a clear definition of poverty and its drivers. So a number of the local authorities featured developed poverty profiles, and this was to understand the nature and drivers relevant to the local areas to ensure that actually they are targeting local needs specifically. So the next element is focusing on prevention, reduction and mitigation. So at its core, an anti-poverty strategy must focus on preventing and reducing poverty. So strategy should adopt medium and long-term actions. So there are a number of policies and initiatives that were pretty critical to the council's approaches. So these included, for example, maximising household income and building inclusive economies really came out strong. Councils also need to focus on immediate financial crisis through local welfare provision. So steps that councils can take include taking a cash first approach. We then have the next element, which is about prioritisation. So to ensure strategies are realistic and feasible, local authorities need to clearly articulate what they can do to make a difference and include actions, for example, working with partners, lobbying central government. So all the strategies were really clear about the role different stakeholders have, and it's important to understand the sphere of influence that local authorities have. The next key element was lived experience engagement and co-production. So people with lived experience of poverty should be involved from the outset of the development of a local anti-poverty strategy. So localities need to create the conditions for people to fully participate in a meaningful way. So this takes time, patience, planning. And what we found through speaking to local authorities and through our own experience is that they should be run by external partners. And actually often local authorities can be seen as the danger rather than the solution. And it's actually through trusted intermediaries that actually more meaningful engagement can be made. So the next key element is political and officer leadership. So the local authorities had political leadership. Each one did. Most councils had a cabinet or executive member with an explicit anti-poverty profile. And there was a real emphasis that this was important to the strategy development and implementation, and it gave the strategies greater focus, and more external stakeholders were willing to engage with the councils as a result. So the next key element is about partnership work. And so local authorities are not able to address poverty in isolation in no way, shape or form. So local authorities need to engage with stakeholders working in partnerships to establish anti-poverty partnership groups, to clarify requirements and expectations on how best to work together to achieve the objectives set out in the strategies. So for example, in Leicester, they have developed an anti-poverty network. So partners who join the network come together, working towards the objectives of the strategy, and submit their own action plans, highlighting the work they are doing and how they plan to measure its impact. And the next element is reinforcing and aligning with existing strategies. So given the cross-cutting nature of poverty, an anti-poverty strategy must not sit in isolation. So there needs to be a strong focus on tackling poverty in, for example, corporate strategies, economic housing and equality policies. So there needs to be stronger clarity around responsibility within departments on specific actions set out. So this will in turn save valuable time and resources. So the next key element is an action plan. So actions to deliver the aims and objectives of the strategy need to be kept under review. So accompanying a strategy should be an action plan. So the councils describe the action plan as being really important to facilitate priority setting and transparency around actually how the council is making progress. So the next key element is governance. So anti-poverty strategies should be subject to both internal and external governments. So they should be taking on responsibility for monitoring progress and overseeing the implementation of the strategy. So within the case studies featured, internal working groups and committees made up of council officers were set up to monitor the progress, and then also externally involving, for example, local strategic partnerships. We then have monitoring and evaluation. So monitoring and evaluation of an anti-poverty strategy is critical to understand whether actually the actions set out are making a difference. So this is by no means a simple or straightforward task, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach. However, our findings have highlighted that local authorities should use a range of key local indicators, both quantitative and qualitative. So it's about really combining local knowledge, learning from other local authorities and using national data. So some of the strategies included public-facing dashboards. So these included key local indicators about poverty, but it also must be said that although quantitative data is very important, qualitative data should not be overlooked, as we know that actually speaking to people who are working on the front line, you get a better idea of actually what local action is making a difference. We should also mention that anti-poverty strategies require a mix of light touch annual reviews and also longer term impact reporting. Then the next key element is adopting the socioeconomic duty. So local authorities should voluntarily adopt the socioeconomic duty. So this is contained in section 1 of the Equality Act, which requires public authorities to actively consider the impact of their decisions on people who are facing socioeconomic disadvantage. So we've seen that successive governments have not enacted the duty, and socioeconomic disadvantage is often missing from equality impact assessments. At GMPA, we have been working with a range of local authorities and combined authorities to really actively promote and increase awareness that adoption is important in a strategic approach. So Salford, for example, one of the case studies featured, has voluntarily adopted the duty, and its impact is already being seen in practice instead of just being a tick box exercise. And then finally, we have adaptability. So an anti-poverty strategy cannot stand still. For it to serve its purpose, it should be viewed as being adaptable. So it's really important to be able to continuously review the strategy and not let it just sit aside. That's the only way that actual change is going to happen. So I will now just go to my final slide, which is just presenting a summary. So to summarise, local anti-poverty strategies can help make a difference when action orientated and actually realistic in what local authorities are able to do. So it's really about having that understanding of what local assets are available, resources, and a good understanding of poverty in a local area. That's important. So again, tackling poverty is everybody's business, and an anti-poverty strategy shows that everyone has a role to play when it comes to an anti-poverty strategy. Another key points to mention is that a strategy needs to be flexible and open to change. Again, it cannot stand still and it shouldn't look like a shopping list. So, and an anti-poverty strategy is about actually learning new ways of working. And although many of the findings are not new, it's actually about changing the way we are working. So it's about prioritising poverty and not being hesitant to call it what it is, because poverty is not going away, and without action, it's only going to get worse. So moving forward, there is considerable scope for further research, and at GMPA, we are building on our year's worth of work to look into policies that sit underneath an anti-poverty strategy. So for example, building on our work on cash first approach, supporting people with lived experience into policy making, and also real living wage. So thank you everyone for listening, and Shari will be speaking next. Okay, so I'd just like to introduce Shari from Salford City Council, and she will be giving an overview of Salford's approach. So thank you, Shari. Oh, I think you're just on mute there. We'll go to Stephen just while Shari fixes her microphone. So 1 second. Okay, Stephen, if you won't mind just taking over for a second just to discuss Scotland's approach.
Not at all. I'll warm them up for Shari. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to share the experience from Scotland and learn from experience elsewhere, which I think is very important. Just to introduce myself and I think why I'm here. I'm Stephen Sinclair. I work at Glasgow Caledonian University in a research centre called SPIRU, Scottish Poverty Inequality Research Unit. We're one of 7 national partners, as they're called, who work with the Scottish Government to advise, support and help them implement their national mission to reduce child poverty. The other members are the Improvement Service, which is an advisory public sector organisation, Scottish Government itself, Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, Public Health Scotland, Child Poverty Action Group and the Poverty Alliance. So I think that's a sign of one of the themes that's going to come up and which has been very ably expressed by Penny, is the importance of partnership working. If you go on to the next slide, please, Penny. So this is what I'm going to cover briefly. I think much of it will be familiar to you because it's very ably covered in the report and in Penny's presentation. It's a very impressive and thorough report, and it's great to see so many positive recommendations within it. I think a lot of those correspond with the experience that we have in Scotland. I'm going to talk about those experiences and highlight what I regard are 4 or 5 of the most important lessons before making some final remarks. But first, I think it's important just to have a little bit more context about the background to the strategy and action at a national and local level in Scotland. So if we go on to the next slide, I will just briefly cover the Child Poverty Scotland Act. This will be familiar to you from Penny's presentation, including the diagram about the drivers, which I'll come on to speak about. So some of this, the more detail you can find in the report itself. In 2017, as Penny explained, the Scottish Parliament unanimously passed the Child Poverty Scotland Act, which reinstated the a statutory commitment to what at that time was expressed as eradicating child poverty. That phrase seems to be removed, but it's still a national mission to significantly reduce child poverty by 2030. We won't go into the details of how poverty is defined in each case unless anyone wants to ask a question about that. But those are the targets for 2030. There are 4 income-based targets, and there are interim targets which are supposed to be reported on this year. Another aspect of the Act is a statutory duty for the Scottish Government to publish 3 successive child poverty delivery plans. The first, called Every Child, Every Chance, was published in 2018. That's now been succeeded by the second, called Best Starts, Bright Futures, which was published last year. And that will run up to 2026 when the final one will be published. In each of these, there is a commitment and an emphasis on tackling what the Scottish Government and the national partners and most analysts identify as the 3 key drivers of child poverty, which are highlighted in this diagram: increasing income from employment, reducing household living costs and expenses, and increasing income from social security and other benefits in kind. And each of these is underpinned by a number of more specific duties. The last significant element of the Child Poverty Act in Scotland was the creation of a statutory poverty and inequality commission, whose responsibility is to provide oversight, advice, guidance, and to a certain extent hold the national government and local authorities to account. If you go on to the next slide, please. A significant development in the Scottish case of the 2017 Act was to introduce a statutory duty, as Penny's explained, on local authorities and their health board partners to produce annual child poverty action reports, or LCPARs. That was significant because under the 2010 Act, the UK Act, there wasn't such a duty in Scotland. The first reports were published in 2019. So we now have sort of 4 waves of reports. Not every authority has published their year 4 report yet, but we have quite a cumulative body of documentation explaining how local authorities are fulfilling their duty. In the Act, there are no local child poverty targets as such. Rather, the duty that the health boards and local authorities have is to report on what actions they are taking and plan to address these 3 drivers at the local level. The Scottish Government have introduced or implemented for a long time what they call an outcomes-based approach. That is, they set aspirations and targets in a general sense for their local authority partners, but they're not prescriptive in the mechanisms that they require. They believe that local authorities and health board partners and community planning partnerships know what might be best in their local circumstances. So there's lots of guidance, lots of advice, but relatively few instructions from the Scottish Government in how local authorities should go about this work. What they suggest is that local child poverty action reports should address 3 questions. Essentially, what do we know locally about child poverty, its distribution, the forms of need? What actions are required in order to address these needs? And how will we know if it's working? How do we know it's effective? They also strongly recommend that there's what they call a clear line of sight between local actions and the 3 key poverty drivers. So there should be a very clear connection and rationale for what is action taken and what is reported, and these 3 key drivers of income from employment, household costs, and income from social security. One of the few stipulations in the Act and in the guidance is that local child poverty action reports should specify what action they're taking to meet the needs of 6 priority household types, who collectively make up about 90% of children experiencing poverty in Scotland. So there's a good analytical reason for that prescription. If we go on to the next slide, please. So I'm now going to briefly consider what I regard as some of the key lessons from the cumulative experience of the 4 cycles of reports that we've had since 2019. It is very difficult, obviously, to make much impact on national child poverty figures at the local level. But there is evidence that focused and effective local action can still make a difference. And the most impressive, most effective local strategies are those which focus on key areas where they are most likely to have greatest impact at the local level, rather than, as Penny said, that they cover absolutely everything which is potentially related to child poverty. Those would be messy reports, and some of the first ones did do that. They put in everything. But over time, local authorities and the health board partners have learned more and more to be focused. So examples of key areas where local authorities and health boards do have leverage and could take action are improving parents' access to employment opportunities and access to local services, identifying the barriers they might face, which could be quite specific in particular communities, actions to increase income through benefits, identifying the administrative blockages which could be addressed there, such as locating advice and money advice services in inaccessible areas, such as primary schools and GPs practices and so on. And also action to really take a child poverty lens. That is, think about the implications for any policy or any measure, any cut, for example, what it's going to have on households which are particularly vulnerable to poverty, including those 6 priority groups, and embed a commitment to child poverty across every department. And I'll briefly mention that in a few moments. Last feature of a good report, and the most impressive reports, is that they are not, as Penny says, they're not fixed. They learn and reflect from practice and share experience from across different authorities and sources. Next slide, please. Partnership working is a statutory requirement. It's also essential. Effective local strategies benefit from the value that can be added by collaboration. A productive partnership can do more together than an individual organization can achieve on its own. And some of the qualities of an effective partnership are there, and again, echoed in Penny's presentation and in the report. So clear agreed roles and responsibilities, commitment at every level, particularly senior level and political leadership commitment, and governance and oversight systems so that people know what they're responsible for and to whom they're reporting. That's particularly challenging in a multi-agency partnership. Some of the direction of travel that's showing, I think, promise in terms of partnership working is a move towards, these look like buzzwords and catchphrases, but I think they're quite genuine. The idea of a whole systems approach, a no wrong door approach, and an every contact counts approach. What that means in practice is that, for example, service users won't be asked to provide the same information to multiple agencies. That sectors and the departments within a local authority will pool and share and refer service users to each other, so that there won't be multiple demands on their time. There won't be a huge administrative burden on a service user to get the needs that they have met. And there's a particular example about how to do this from Inverclyde in partnership with Public Health Scotland, which is described in the notes that are in this presentation, and you can look at the reference to that if you wish. Could we go on to the next slide, please? So data intelligence and gathering is a big challenge. It's very difficult to get local data, particularly divided by subgroups, looking at, for example, BME groups by lone parenthood, by region, or at the data zone level, or I believe it with the super outcome area level, is very challenging. But what we've emphasized is that it's not necessarily hard figures that really matter. Where they're available, great, but it's local intelligence, local understanding. And that information comes from multiple sources, can come from food banks, it can come particularly from the third sector, community organizations. That rounded picture of local needs, local barriers, and potential local solutions is what's important. There are great and heroic efforts in many local authorities to try and pull data, to use data from the DWP, from HMRC, Glasgow in particular, partly because they have the resources, have pioneered that, but there are others. It's challenging, it's technically difficult, but it's very valuable because it can help one thing which is important, which is benefit automation, which significantly increases uptake. Can I have the next slide, please? Can't emphasize this enough, but I'm not going to speak about it much because Penny already has covered it. The people who know most and best about local conditions are people who are living with them and those who serve them. They have to be involved. They are the experts. We can advise on technicalities and so on, but the insights from service providers and service users is essential. Next slide, please. So a couple of areas where I think more work is required. There are some important service areas and powers which are not as fully involved as we would like to see. It's patchy across the country, but some of the areas that don't get covered are housing, planning, transport, and particularly economic regeneration. And Spyro did a separate project on city deals, regional economic partnerships, and the extent to which they embrace the child poverty agenda. I have to, since I'm talking to this community, flag up the pioneering work on community wealth building. There are great hopes attached to that. Preston, of course, has pioneered it. We've yet to see exactly how it's going to pan out, but it's already offering some interesting lessons about joining up services and thinking holistically about the capacities of local and regional powers. And Ayrshire are adopting some of that practice. But what we really need is step change. There have been step changes in the past. Things like cost of the school day was an innovation in its day, and now it's really embedded in quite a number of local authorities. But we need to not just do things better, but we need to do things differently, and in some cases do different things. Some of these different things are quite significant organizational changes, things like pulling budgets and staff, wiring money from one sector to another, devolving decision-making to the local level, the front service delivery level. This was something that was pioneered and very effective during the emergency response to COVID. We need to redesign services and provision around the lives and needs of users, not in accordance with existing departments and existing budgets. And my final slide, please. A couple of final points. Local officers who are charged with writing these annual reports often say that they're very time consuming, that they spend more time in some cases writing the reports than doing the work to actually implement the report. And that is a challenge, particularly for smaller local authorities. However, in response to that, some authorities have moved towards more strategic 3 to 5 year strategies, and their annual reports are only sort of brief updates. In the face of cuts, and in the face of, as you can see from this graph, the fact that we are going to struggle to meet the interim target, let alone the long-term target, it might be despondent. There might be concern that we're not going to have the effect. So we need to reinforce the capacity that local authorities have and to offer practical hope, deliverable, realistic suggestions that can be then implemented and do have an impact. And one of these, just to end on a positive note, is the idea of what Ernest Bevan called the spirit of administration. How things are done and how services are provided is crucial. Services which treat users with dignity, with respect, which are designed to help rather than penalize them, make a huge impact on the experience and on the mental health and well-being of the service user. It's also better to work in an organization which is doing that. It has an impact on staff morale, and it can reinforce and recommit our efforts to really have a significant impact on child poverty. So thank you for listening, and I think I ran over by a minute or so, but hope I haven't taken too much of Shari's time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Stephen. So next will be Shari from Salford, who will be talking about Salford's approach. So I'll just go back to the slides.
Thank you, Penny. I'll just check. Am I okay on audio now?
Yes, all good.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Apologies and thank you. Big thanks to Stephen there. That was really quick thinking on Penny's part. I would never have been that quick, and Stephen was like straight away right in there to Stephen, so thank you both so much. So hi everyone, thank you for coming along to listen today. My name's Shari Bowes and I'm the Principal Policy Officer for Poverty and Equality here at Salford City Council. I'm just going to talk briefly today about some of Salford's journey in implementing our own tackling poverty strategy over the years. It'll be very much a lot of the same elements that Penny and Stephen have spoken about, so I'm going to highlight that from a local authority standpoint and hopefully show some of the ways that it's being implemented here in Salford City Council. So just a really bit of brief background before I actually go into talking about our tackling poverty strategy. In terms of why we went and decided to implement one. Our first tackling poverty strategy was put in place in 2017, and obviously the context for this was after quite a few years of austerity. There'd been significant welfare reform and local government cuts to certain services, which obviously, as we always talk about, didn't just create a lot of inequality here, not just within Salford, but obviously across the country, but also we've seen it exacerbated a lot of that inequality, whether that was pushing people that might have just been on the line between that into poverty, or put those people who were already experiencing poverty into more hardship. So Penny, if you could just go on to the first sort of slide, that'd be great. Thank you. Fab, thank you. So in terms of what motivated Salford to put in place that first anti-poverty strategy, so the Salford City Mayor, Paul Dennett, was elected in 2016, and there was a great deal of prioritisation on tackling poverty and inequality as part of that leadership coming into the council. We had that political will there and that leadership approach that really recognised that what we really wanted here in our city was a very Salford specific, tailored approach that was really unique to the city. And what we were really hoping to do with that was account for the likes of lived experiences, all the different ideas within co-production, and also really recognise and emphasise that there wasn't just one single solution to that issue of tackling poverty and inequality. So as I said, that first anti-poverty strategy came about in 2017, and a lot of the aim within that was to ensure that a lot of the issues we were capturing at a citywide level were given a formal approach, a very proactive and coordinated response across the city with a real focus on tackling poverty and inequality. And I've just laid out here some of the reasons we wanted to put that formalised strategy in place. It's that idea for anybody here who's thinking of designing a anti-poverty strategy for the local authority area, that idea of strengthening coordination of the anti-poverty work across the city, bringing together all the different organisations and institutions across the city who have invested interest in tackling poverty. Again, that idea of recognition of a full city approach and as much partnership working as possible. Another really important point that both Stephen and Penny touched on, building also within your tackling poverty strategy, within the development, that really robust and knowledgeable understanding of poverty at localised levels. And when we talk about this, we also want to really emphasise that intersectional approach and the way poverty impacts on different communities within our city, and making sure we're also really recognising that and ensuring that we're not just taking a one-size solution fits all when we're looking at service delivery and emergent issues. Other really important point that I really can't stress enough, and what we try and emphasise here in Salford, is the idea that within our tackling poverty strategy at a qualitative level, it's very much about empowering everyone within our city to recognise poverty as a societal issue. It is not an individual problem, and we need to make sure that communities feel part of the solution. Something that's really, really important, and making sure that individuals don't feel like it is their fault that they're in poverty. And just finally, in terms of the development of our strategy, what we wanted to do with it was ensure it was being used as a formal approach for how we were looking at putting in place solutions for our service delivery and for across our communities, to make sure that everything we were putting in place was really inclusive and was being tailored to local needs. So Penny, if you could just go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So I've just put on this slide the 3 strategic priorities that we identified within the development of the first Salford Tackling Poverty strategy back in 2017. And very roughly, whenever I'm talking about them, I always just say support, prevent, and campaign. And by this, what we mean is identifying those 3 strategic points which we want to use to build upon as the foundation for all our tackling poverty work. And just here briefly, I've also put down Salford's development in coordination with the likes of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation of their own definition of poverty. Really important, and I know this was one of GMPA's 12 recommendations, which I was so happy to see on there, because I think it's something that doesn't tend to be talked about enough. The reason that we went about and developed our own definition was to show that when we think of poverty, we want all our services in the city not to just be thinking about poverty being about lacking basic needs. It is about lacking the needs that are essential to be a part of your community, and making sure that our communities can access all those activities that are crucial to be a part of community life. And that's really, really important. So again, it's about having that societal approach, ensuring that people feel like they are a part of their communities. Next slide, please, Penny. Thank you. And just briefly, as we've moved on and refreshed our strategy in 2021, just wanted to touch on, we've kept our same 3 priorities the same. And I really just wanted to emphasize that, and that these priorities can always stay the same, but as long as there is that adaptability underneath them, and making sure that our actions, whether that is prevention and ensuring that we've got long-term approaches to stopping people falling into poverty in the first place, whether that's providing that targeted support for people struggling in poverty. Obviously, that's been one that's came to the forefront, particularly in the last few months with the cost of living crisis. And crucially, that we're using all the levers at our disposal to campaign for long-term change, whether that's at a local, regional or national level. So if you could just go to the next slide, Penny. Thank you so much. So I think for local authorities here who are looking at going about developing a tackling poverty strategy and using the framework that Graham Penny and the team of so with all their hard and diligent work have created within this report, I think what will probably come about is the strategic priorities will probably be quite roughly similar across the country, but what will maybe be different is those particular actions depending on your local authority area and where you are, the likes of your economy, what your communities look like, and just making sure it's really, really tailored to your approach. So here I've just put together some quick bullet points about building that achievable plan under our tackling poverty strategy and what that really means, whether that's continued co-production aspect of organisations, and also ensuring that it's not just about taking a consultative approach after you've put in place your policies or decisions, but really making sure people feel like they are part of the solution from the very beginning. Also, I think another key point to focus on is ensuring that all services and organisations understand how their work aligns with the high-level priorities within your approach. Not only is that important to ensure there's a clear anti-poverty focus being embedded throughout all the work that's going on across the city, but I think it also makes sure that there is no duplication of resources where it's not needed, and that there is clear referral pathways in process, particularly across different services and different sectors. Another point to really get across within the tackling poverty strategies, and particularly I think when you're embedding action plans is place, is to make sure specific actions around different targeted areas and understanding how different organisations play a part of that, but also emphasising that it's very much about that whole scale approach and bringing everything together. And finally, within tackling poverty strategy, ensuring there is those key strategic mechanisms in place. And when we talk about that, what we really wanted to do within ours was ensure that we were making a rigorous commitment to our implementation of the socio-economic duty, which I know Penny highlighted earlier. It's in that theory that it's not just paying lip service to it, and by having it within your tackling poverty strategy and subsequently your tackling poverty action plan, you're making sure you've got clear and cohesive actions, whether that's introducing a specific framework around implementing the socio-economic duty or rolling out training to make sure it's embedded across all your services. Thanks, Penny. Just on to the final slide, if you don't mind. Perfect, thank you. So just going forward in terms of key points, I wanted to highlight as Salford's work progresses. As I says, we've had our first tackling poverty strategy in place since 2017 and refreshed in 2021. What this has done over these 6 years has given us ample opportunity to not just understand what we want to take forward, but also looking at what we want to refresh within our approach and make sure, as Stephen and Penny both commented on, that we're making sure that we're still adapting things and tailoring it to specific issues. This is particularly important as we've just seen with the cost of living crisis. We found that we had to tailor our own tackling poverty action plan to look at different things, particularly under strategic priority 2 of targeting support where it is most needed. But under that as well, I think it's just key to say that within GMPA's 12 recommendations that they have developed, some of the other ones that I think are really ample to highlight that are part of Salford's journey is that assurance of the objective and external scrutiny, having that governance in place, both at a political level, whether that's with your citywide leadership and also with your scrutiny boards, being open to new recommendations and adaptability for delivery of the strategy, whether that's recommendations coming in from other organisations or through new data integration that you're able to get hold of, and using that to harness new opportunities for tackling poverty, embedding socioeconomic consideration throughout all work that's done, and making sure there's a strong tackling poverty focus throughout everything you do. I really liked when Penny said earlier about ensuring a tackling poverty strategy wasn't just on the shelf, which I think is I think everyone that's worked in policy throughout the years knows that that can sometimes be a common theme. So yeah, I think that's really, really crucial to say, making sure that approach is embedded. And again, keeping co-production at the heart of everything that's done. So thank you, that's me.
Oh, thank you, Sherry. I'll just skip to the question slides, great.
Okay, Brill, thanks, Penny. Right, great. Okay, so a few questions have been coming in. I think Stephen's responded to a few. So we'll just take a look. I think, Penny, just first question for you, if that's all right. I had a question from Becca from Save the Children. Just a reminder, really, what are those local drivers of poverty locally? What are the things we can do in terms of maximising household income and responding to the needs of residents in that space as local authorities and our partners?
Yeah, so really it's just about having a look at actually what local authority direct services that we deliver. So we've seen that actually one of the biggest things is, local welfare assistance schemes. So a lot of the schemes were really kind of resident focused, making sure that they were providing furniture provision, and also having that cash first approach was really important. And then also it's about also working in partnership with other organisations. So I think it goes on to another question as well, but actually working, for example, with community housing associations really came through strong. So utilising your partnership network is important. That does offer kind of other ways to address poverty. And then again, this is another one, but again, lobbying the government is really something that should be being done by councils, really. And that was something that came across in all of the strategies. That was a strand. And as Sherry said, Salford is doing that as well. So kind of direct service delivery, then partnership working, and then again, lobbying for change at a higher level really came through as being important. That's
great, thanks, Penny. And I thought the diagram, which I think we've replicated in our report, which Stephen showed, looking at those drivers of poverty is really helpful and informative as well in terms of thinking, okay, what are the interventions you can make locally to help boost household income, and that's proving really useful both for us in terms of our thinking, but I know for lots of our stakeholders across Greater Manchester and beyond. So that's good to see. Shira, there was a question about sort of the impact of having an anti-poverty strategy in Salford. What sort of impact has it had on policy and practice? And I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind maybe just telling us a little bit about the socioeconomic duty adoption specifically, because I know that Salford City Council is now using that in a way that's having a direct impact on the decisions you make as a council.
Yeah, of course, no problem, Graham. I was actually just replying to Kate in the chat there. So in fact, I think her question was quite similar. It was how the 2017 strategy impacted. So if you don't mind, I'll take that one first and sort of go in.
That's fine, yeah.
Fab, thanks, Graham. So I think, first of all, in terms of having that strategy in 2017 that was then refreshed, was a really beneficial approach to us. What I always try and emphasise is that the 2021 one was a refresh. It wasn't a new strategy. The three strategic priorities are completely the same. But for me, one of the biggest benefits of it is it gave a really formalised approach to measuring how different services and different areas, whether that's employment, education, housing, etc., were all working collaboratively together to tackle poverty. And for me, that meant as well, it gave you areas to identify where, might need strengths and improvements made. That was for me probably the big thing, and it's something we've taken on and have continued to do. And I know that's one of GMPA's 12 recommendations, that idea of continuously monitoring and the sort of governance aspect of it. In terms of how the strategy is influenced policy and practice, well, I'm going to be a bit biased because I lead on the strategy, so I'm going to say it's very much influenced policy and practice. But yes, it has definitely had a big influence, but particularly as well, and another one of the GMPA's recommendations is that political will and that political lead. We in Salford have a cabinet member who is specifically there as a lead member for tackling poverty, and this has been a really, really big help in terms of how the other services see their policies as playing into the tackling poverty framework and embedding it. And that, Graham, actually, that was very clever of you, because it brings me on to the socio-economic duty, actually, because what I think is the most important thing about the way that we've rolled out here in Salford, we implemented a framework around how to do that with a very much some sort of practical Salford specific examples. As anyone who works here knows, I think sometimes we're always very good in policy at producing guidance without actually going into the practicalities of how it works for frontline services. So that was really important for us. We brought in some guidance with some Salford specific examples and how we would use the socio-economic duty in tandem and streamlined into the equality impact assessment process. And the most important thing for me personally when we were putting it out, which I think was really effective, was we rolled out interactive training throughout a 6-month period across the City Council for services, but also really importantly for elected members, so that they understood their role in the scrutiny of socio-economics as part of committees and the like. So that's been really crucial. And what we've really tried to emphasise with that is about embedding socio-economic considerations in everything we do, whether that's policies, service design or decision making. So I would like to think that hopefully that and the tackling poverty strategy has influenced it all. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great, Sharon. That's been really good to see, and we've been really encouraged by both the strategy and the impact it's having, but also specifically the work around the socio-economic duty and the application of that, which like I say, is really interesting to see and really encouraging. And I think a lot, that places across the whole of England, not just local authorities, but the public bodies will be able to learn from there. Stephen, there was a question. Thanks for responding to a few of the questions. There was one from Joe Farnworth at the Trussell Trust around the Cash First pilot. So the new Cash First partnership pilot's coming soon. How will these complement the existing duties on local authorities?
Thanks. Yeah, the national partners, particularly the campaigning organisations, Child Poverty Action Group and Poverty Alliance, are very strong advocates of a cash first approach. And I think one of the key lessons, which is UK-wide from the COVID response, is that things like vouchers and food bags and so on are fine and good, particularly in the full lockdown. But acknowledging that people know best what their needs are, that they have the capacity to responsibly look after themselves if you give them cash, is the best way forward. There are complex, in some cases, and very technical benefit implications if you go above a certain level. And it gets more complicated because Scotland is different when it comes to the benefit system. But I think it corresponds very strongly with the ethos and the direction of the strategy. I'm not sure about exactly what's happening in England, but one of the good things about events such as this is that we hope that we can learn from you. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned, for example, we did from 2010 to 2016, local authorities in England had a reporting duty. That's an untapped resource. There's a lot of paperwork there, a lot of documentation there, and a lot of potential learning. In an ideal world, I'd have time to look through that. But other people have, and other people have written them. So I would like to hear as much from the Trussell Trust about Cash First approach as hold forth about it, other than say we strongly endorse it as an approach.
Yeah, great, thanks. Fantastic, Stephen. And I think Joe and colleagues would point us to the outcome of the trial, Cash First trial in Leeds, where Trussell Trust worked with the City Council there and some of the local food banks on providing monetary grants to beneficiaries there. So that's been really interesting. People can read the evaluation there. If Joe's listening still, if he's still on, if he wants to share the link to that, that'd be fantastic. Brilliant, good. Thank you very much. So that's been really good to see. And obviously I think that a lot of people on the webinar will know that the sort of Cash First approach is something we very much promote as Greater Manchester Poverty Action. And we're really keen and interested in what other trials and pilots we might introduce in places like Greater Manchester and beyond to test out that approach. So just let me have a little quick look here. I think just a question there, maybe it just speaks back to Stephen's point there around was a question there from someone around, you know, has anywhere been doing this long enough as a locality in terms of having an anti-poverty strategy approach that's enabled to actually sort of measure some impact over time? I don't know whether, Penny, was that something you identified when you were doing the research? Is it still a gap? Do we need to sort of let more time pass?
Yeah, definitely what came out from the research is that you have to let time pass to actually see whether the milestones have made a significant impact. And also, I'd like to say it's not just about the quantitative data, it's really actually about what's going on the ground that really came out as being the most important.
Great, thanks, Penny. Stephen, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, just briefly, one can get, as I mentioned, you get very despondent. You can do all this excellent work and there seems to be no change in the figures. I mean, first of all, there's always a delay in the figures. Anyway, they're a year behind, but even so, the big drivers are at national and international level. But no one, I'm sure, is in favouring of a council of despair, and therefore we shouldn't do anything. There is a difference in the form of delivery, as I mentioned. There is an impact in the longer term by good action now, which might not show up in figures, but will show up in children's capabilities and experiences when they grow up. There are very specific things that can be done about benefit uptake, income maximisation, about cross-referral. I think it's excellent now that, for example, healthcare staff regard it as part of their job to refer people to money advice. It's not a, you know, it's groundbreaking and it's there, but it's now commonplace. That's very significant. So those are the sorts of measures that can be taken. As I say, the Community Wealth Building Initiative or similar projects where the power of local public sector as an anchor institution, as a massive employer, as a huge presence in the community with considerable procurement powers, those still remain underdeveloped and there is still capacity there. There are legal restrictions to a certain extent, but they are exaggerated in the mind of many local authorities. They have more capacity than they often think, and there have been studies of what are the legal restraints, again in a Scottish context. But there is more that could be done, and often it's sort of a lack of imagination and to a certain extent anxiety that prevents that. But there are good examples that we can learn from, even if the stats don't show it in the short term. Great,
thanks, Stephen. That's fine. Shari, did you want to come, before I move on to the next steps, is there anything you want to come back in on?
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Just really to echo what Stephen says, it's something that we really emphasise here, is that not to get kind of bogged down in that quantitative data. And sometimes, unfortunately, particularly right now, it's something I found myself echoing at the end of last year a lot with the cost of living crisis. If you know our stats in a year or 2 years' time, or it might just be that we're just the same, but unfortunately, some local authorities may see that as a success. Just depending on where it is, as Stephen says, you know, a lot of these things are more influenced at a national level. But yeah, I think it's really crucial we don't get despondent and just consistently looking for other ways that we can look at referral pathways between services, how we're getting across our tackling poverty agenda, and just making sure it's embedded within all our work is really, really important. And also the qualitative work, whether that's local authorities starting a poverty truth commission. I know GMPA has been working with the likes of Tameside to do a lot of work of that, I think, which also gives us feedback as well on how the anti-poverty strategies are working locally.
Wonderful, thanks, Shari. That's great. So brilliant. Okay, thanks for all the questions and comments. So we're not necessarily time to get back to everyone there, but we've recorded the chat and we'll copy the questions that came up in the Q&A box as well, and come back to people with some further thoughts afterwards, if that's okay. I mean, just really interesting, that point about sort of metrics. I think one of the things that, you know, having worked on sort of poverty issues nationally and then in more recent years through Greater Manchester Poverty Action locally, I think for local leaders, you know, that's been a frustration. Okay, well, we can see these big levers being pulled by central government, which means that actually the things we're doing locally don't really touch those local child poverty or the figures. But you know, I think it's about, and I think Penny talks about this in the report as well, it's about identifying the things that you can measure locally to enable you to understand the progress that you're making, whether that's around real living wage adoption or the labour market indicators, whether that's, and the data needs to get better in this space, but whether that's data around sort of and benefit uptake locally. There are things that we can sort of look at locally to sort of identify whether we're moving things in the right direction as local stakeholders and those that hold power locally. So thanks so much, Stephen, Penny and Shari for that response to the questions. We've just gone to the next slide, Penny. I'm just going to talk through people through a few next steps. Next slide, Penny, as well. So just to say, I mean, this piece of work for us doesn't sit in isolation. You know, we've worked on Greater Manchester Poverty Action has existed since 2016. It became somebody's job, my job, and somebody else's job a little bit later than that when we started to get some funding in. But we've developed a number of resources as an organisation over recent years, everything from our socioeconomic duty guide, which talks local authorities and other public sector organisations step by step through how they can voluntarily adopt and implement the socioeconomic duty, through to the work that we're doing with 6 out of 10 Greater Manchester councils at the moment through our money advice referral tools. And that's about supporting those organisations that are referring and signposting people to support, to do so in a way that maximises the ability of clients and beneficiaries to access money and advice as part of their journey through local support systems, and really steering people away from charitable food aid and other in-kind sources of support to make sure we're doing that income maximisation bit as best we can. So lots of resources on our website. We'll really encourage people to go away and look at those after today's webinar. Next slide, Penny. And then just to say, in terms of, for those of you from organisations from across Greater Manchester, we have our principal partner scheme at Greater Manchester Poverty Action. It's our core method of funding the organisation. And Penny, if you go to the next slide, we've got lots of organisations, both local councils, local housing providers, some national and international NGOs who are part of the principal partner scheme. And if that's something that you'd like to get involved with, Salford Council on there, of course, Manchester City Council as well. If that's something you'd like to get involved with, please drop me an email or get in touch with Lucy, our fundraising officer, and we'll talk to you about that a little bit more and how you might get involved. It's been really crucial. It's been the bedrock on which the organisation's been built, and organisations make a financial contribution as part of the principal partner scheme, but also provide advice and support in other ways, which is really valued by ourselves and makes a big difference to the work that we do across Greater Manchester and now beyond. Next slide, Penny. And then just want to say, in terms of, I know we've got a lot of people registered for the webinar and have been interested in the work that Penny and the team have been doing as part of this project from outside Greater Manchester. And one of the areas that's been really interesting for us actually is we've had a lot of non-Greater Manchester councils get in touch with us around socioeconomic duty adoption and implementation, certainly since the onset of the pandemic. And we're very much kind of looking to work with local authorities and partners in other parts of the country on things like developing anti-poverty strategies, adopting and implementing the socioeconomic duty, or on more specific areas like engaging people with lived experience of poverty in decision making, or thinking about how you make best use of the household support fund and improve local welfare provision. So again, on that one, if we've got people who'd like to work with us and have a conversation about how you might do that and how we might work in partnership, please do get in touch with myself and we can pick that up and have a conversation with you. And we're really encouraged actually about, I think, the way in which the focus on poverty in Greater Manchester really has increased over recent years. And we've moved away from a period where I think there was that despondency about the anti-poverty fight and not really being able to do much locally. And we've really pushed past that, which I think has been encouraging and good to see. And I know other localities in England are doing that as well. And we very much want to support different parts of the country on that journey. So please do get in touch. Next slide, Penny. And then just to say, in terms of, so the report's available on the website, the link's there. We will get these slides up on our website as well as quickly as we can. There's the full report, there's an exec summary. The framework that I sent a link to in the chat is also available to download, which is just a nice 2-page kind of guide overview of the framework, those 12 recommendations that Penny's taken us through, and also the individual case studies which are in the report. You can download them as standalone PDFs. So if you want to look at in more detail at the stuff that Shirey talked us through, or you're interested in any of the other areas that Penny talked us through, the other 5 case studies out of the 6, do have a look at those at your leisure. And then, as I say, we'll get the slides and then the webinar recording on the website as well, and let people know when that's ready. In terms of contacting the team about this report specifically, wanting a conversation about it, wanting to understand the work more, please do get in touch with Laura, who's our Senior Policy Research Advisor, or Penny by email, and they'll be happy to explore it further with you. And then last slide. Yeah, so just a big thank you for everyone who's attended today. Huge thank you to Penny, Stephen and Shirey, and also a big thanks to everyone who took part in the research. So all the officers from the 6 case study councils, those individuals and experts who attended our expert panel sessions in September time, I think it was, Penny. Really appreciate the input that people have from different organisations and different perspectives, and also the people with lived experience of poverty who took part in our focus groups, which really did provide the foundation to a lot of the thinking that's in the report. So really appreciate the time that people took to engage with the research. So please do share the report with colleagues, contacts of yours, people in your networks, and on social media using the hashtag anti-poverty strategies. Our Twitter handle is @GMPovertyAction, and we'd really appreciate support from people in just raising awareness of the report. Like I say, I think its value to localities across the country is really clear to see, and we're really excited about working with more and more councils across the country and taking them on that journey. So that's everything from me. Thank you so much for joining us today. Big thank you to our speakers, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you. Right, thanks, Penny. Have you stopped the recording, Penny?